Kia ora koto katoa. I am Professor Mohan Dutta from the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, CARE, at Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm delighted to join you today in this conversation. I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of Rangitane, whose land makes the space for this university and this space for the articulation of knowledge. I also want to acknowledge that the process of decolonization begins with the activist work to return indigenous land. So decolonization is only the beginning when you think about the world of the text. And we have to move from there into the actual struggles of seeking to secure back all those spaces, all those bodies of land that have been stolen and incorporated into the spaces of settler colonialism. So my talk today is titled Cultural Centering as Decolonizing Hegemonic Structures. In offering this talk, I will draw upon the work of CARE, and therefore I acknowledge the many indigenous and local communities across the global south that generously participate in the work of CARE, particularly in the articulations of knowledge systems that challenge the hegemonic structures of capitalism and colonialism. So in this talk, I will first set up the notion of hegemonic structures, the ways in which these structures shape lives and lived experiences, and then the overarching inequalities that are constituted by these structures. I will then offer the key tenets of decolonizing commitment and what these tenets look like. And then I will turn to the culture-centered approach as a theoretical anchor for us to conceptualize the ways in which these hegemonic structures might be dismantled, resisted, and transformed. In this work, I will draw upon my scholarship and the scholarship of many activists, communities, and academics working with the key tenets of the culture-centered approach and seeking to bring about transformations in the organizing of contemporary society. So when we think about hegemonic structures are forms of organizing of society, of politics, economics, culture. And in these systems of organizing, the process of marginalization is inbuilt. In other words, the organizing of hegemonic structures that shape the everyday norms that make up contemporary society, the frameworks of knowledge and the frameworks of everyday interaction make up the processes through which marginalization takes place. Marginalization in this sense is the ongoing exclusion, erasure, and silencing of communities. And if you think about this process of marginalization, we can conceptualize it in terms of three key elements that are intertwined and interconnected with each other. The first is the infrastructure of colonialism, the occupation of indigenous land, the expulsion and alienation of indigenous peoples from their lands, and the ongoing extraction of knowledge, natural resources from colonized contexts in order to serve the agendas of colonizing powers. Now, intertwined with the project of capitalism is colonialism. And capitalism is the ongoing extraction and exploitation of labor to generate profits. Now, the capitalist configuration of organizing economics and politics is directly tied to the imperial expansion of markets and expansion of capitalist formations to extract land and natural resources, as well as to incorporate labor into the systems of profiteering. Now, this interplay between colonialism and capitalism then is held up by knowledge structures, by structures of knowledge that legitimize capitalism and colonialism as the necessary forms of organizing life and as the legitimate forms of organizing life. So on the right hand of the screen, you see an image from the dormitories housing hyper precarious low wage migrant workers in Singapore. And one might not usually think of Singapore in the logic of capitalism, but then when you construct Singapore as the gateway to Asia, it is also the gateway to the ongoing project of colonization into various parts of Asia. And this constitutes the relationship of Singapore with the other contexts of Southeast Asia and shapes, of course, ongoing processes of land colonization and resource extraction, all the way from the theft of sand from neighboring land spaces to the incorporation of Singapore into the discursive logic of empire to serve the interests of imperial formations across Southeast Asia. But Singapore is also the gateway to global capital in Asia. So if you think about the financial economic context of Singapore, this gateway forms the pathway for labor exploitation as well as for generating profits across Asia for global capital. Now, this is rendered possible through the production of spaces of difference and through the production of Singapore as a space of difference articulated through the language of Asian values that is then deployed to silence worker organizing and organizing for labor rights. So going back to the context of migrant work in Singapore, migrant workers in hyper precarious jobs doing dirty, dangerous work in Singapore often come from the context of economies that are struggling and often come from the context of having been expelled from their everyday spaces of life and livelihood because of ongoing neoliberal reforms adopted across Asia. Now, when migrant workers then come into Singapore as laborers, they work under conditions that do not offer them labor rights and that pathologize worker organizing and worker dissent. So a worker can be deported or can be imprisoned for speaking up against the exploitative and extractive structure of the state. And this formation of exploitation is held up by the logics of capital, albeit under the language of or using the language of Asian values that makes worker organizing as a pathology or as something Western. So this ongoing process of knowledge production that incorporates the elite and that draws upon the participation of elite is fundamental to sustaining the networks of capitalism and colonialism. And that's why this is a hegemonic formation, because it perpetuates through the participation of people within that structure that contribute to the systems of extraction and exploitation. So, knowledge structures, in this sense, are vital in thinking through the concept of global transformation for thinking through the ways in which inequalities are organized globally. These knowledge structures are shaped by logics of whiteness that uphold the values of white culture as universal. And through that process, then, on an ongoing basis, impose a hegemonic system of knowledge on communities across the globe. And this system of knowledge uh, renders as legitimate the forces of colonialism and capitalism. So you see this, for instance, in the global rhetoric addressing poverty. The narrative of poverty alleviation often places capital as a solution to poverty, even as capital fundamentally produces the systems of exploitation that underlie the formations of poverty. Now, this infrastructure of whiteness is held up by three key elements: an overarching logic of individualism that individualizes problems and locates the problem in the individual. So we see this in the form of solutions proposed as individual behavior change that are connected to attitudes and beliefs. So within the context of migrant workers in Singapore, for instance, when COVID-19 outbreaks started emerging in dormitories housing low-wage migrant workers, the focus of the mainstream discursive infrastructure was on sending out messages targeting behaviors of workers, seeking to teach workers how to maintain physical distance and how to prevent the spread of the virus, simultaneously erasing the fundamental violence of the arrangement of the dormitories that shaped the context of the outbreaks, with 20 workers often residing in a dormitory, fundamentally raising the lack of access to basic capacities for prevention, such as soaps or clean water or masks. So this logic of individualism is fundamental to the erasure of structures, the structures of capitalism and colonialism that fundamentally underlie the ongoing processes of marginalization. So instead, for communities at the margins, and you see this in a range of approaches to addressing problems globally, all the way from health inequalities to climate change, where the individual is targeted with messages, with the idea that the change in behavior will solve the problem, and fundamentally erasing the structural context that shape the ways in which these problems are created. So this ties into the concept of reductionism, where problems are moved from or separated from the structural context that constitute them, and instead are individualized with solutions directed at the individual. And even at the level of the individual, then the reductionist framing constructs problems in terms of knowledge, in terms of attitude, so that solutions then are framed as solutions seeking to change knowledge or change attitude. And this shapes the infrastructure of cognitivism that separates knowledge from everyday feelings, from everyday ways of being, from the everyday struggles of the body. So knowledge rendered as distinct and distant from the everyday lived experiences of communities becomes the basis for top-down solutions that are imposed on communities by colonial and capitalist structures, which ultimately then turn into prescriptions of more capitalism and more colonialism. So this is the paradox of the uh, hegemonic cycle of knowledge production that actually then proposes the fundamental infrastructures of capitalism and colonialism as the solutions to the very problems that have been created by the forces of capitalism and colonialism. Now, this process, of course, works through the everyday incorporation of communities, and particularly elites from within the communities that are colonized, that are targeted into the infrastructure of knowledge. So co-option of elites is fundamental to the perpetuation of the capitalist colonial structures. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see an image of women who are holding a camera, and this is with the work that CARE has done with oppressed caste or Dalit landless women farmers in southern India. And here the women's struggle to hold sovereignty over everyday forms of agriculture, to retain community knowledge of agriculture, is set against the ongoing processes of colonization that propose neoliberal cash-based agriculture as the solution to the struggles with hunger in the agrarian economies of the global south. And what is really powerful to note here is that the epidemic of farmer suicides, for instance, that you see across the global south, and you certainly see that particularly in India and then this part of India, is constituted by a cash economy, a turn to cash-based, profit-driven economy where farmers take out large loans in order to support water-intensive, fertilizer, and chemical-intensive biotechnology-based agriculture. And that fundamentally removes them from indigenous forms of agriculture that are concerned about questions of care, questions of sustenance, questions of creating food to sustain the community. So this process is carried out through the co-option of elites into these hegemonic systems. So elites within the national infrastructures then propose or put forth and adopt these capitalist solutions that are articulated globally. So you see networks of elites across global economies. You see this across Asia, you see this across Latin America, you see this across Africa, where elites are co-opted into the hegemonic structures in order to put forth and perpetuate the colonial capitalist order, and often doing so with the language of cultural essentialism, where culture is simultaneously turned into an essence, into a static entity in order to support the logics of capital and the expansive reach of the capital. So within the context of Asia, for instance, you see the language of Asian values that is often deployed in order to serve the interests of capital and perpetuate the interests of capital. So you see Asian values being deployed to support extractive practices. You see Asian values being deployed to attack worker rights and worker organizing. And in each of these instances, then dissent, resistance is framed as a Western in order to support the expansion of capital. So cultural essentialism, the portrayal of culture as an essence, is critical to upholding and perpetuating the knowledge structures of exploitation. What is decolonization then? And this is an image from India with migrant workers that were sort of set free on the roads of India when the first lockdown took place amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And this process of setting migrant workers on the roads was tied to expelling them from the spaces in which they were living and working. So you saw images of migrant workers walking in large numbers across the country, often over 1,000 kilometers, in order to simply get home to spaces of security. Now, decolonization in that sense then is fundamentally about dismantling the systems of expulsion, extraction, and exploitation that make up the contemporary political, economic, cultural formations. And this process of decolonization can take place through, I propose, 5 different ways. And here I build upon the work of indigenous scholars and activists, as well as the work of the capitalist, anti-colonial thinkers. And there are some threads that emerge from this work. One of the key threads is this idea that decolonization has to be fundamentally about returning indigenous land. So the struggle for decolonization is the struggle to return the sovereignty. In the Maori epistemology, this is the concept of Tinoranga Tiratanga, community sovereignty over indigenous land. Dismantling racist prison systems, acknowledging that prison systems are built upon systems of enslavement, which are tied to the colonial capitalist project, as brown, black bodies were enslaved and moved across waters in order to be incorporated as caged, bonded, unfree labor, fundamental to the production of profit. So this process of dismantling racist prison systems is about setting free the human body outside of the logics of enslavement as profiteering. And this is tied to the everyday notions of resisting the capitalist systems of exploitation. Now, this can only happen through the dismantling of the ongoing cognitive epistemicide, the ongoing erasure of the voices of diverse indigenous and local communities across the globe. The processes of knowledge production that have fundamentally excluded communities by telling them that you're not good enough, by the incorporation of local elites into creating these systems of pathologization, where communities at the margins are constructed as a pathology to be fixed by hegemonic knowledge systems. So that cognitive infrastructure has to be dismantled. That process of destruction of knowledge forms embedded in everyday lives of local and indigenous communities has to be fundamentally resisted and dismantled. And that process is also fundamentally about seeking to work to build infrastructures of knowledge that are rooted in the everyday lives of communities. And this process is held up through the work of crafting solidarities, by noting that the struggles of indigenous, colonized, enslaved, migrant peoples across the global neoliberal infrastructure are connected in their resistance to capitalism and colonialism. The question then is, how do knowledge systems craft solidarities, craft connections, among South-South struggles, craft connections across indigenous and migrant struggles, craft connections across indigenous and anti-racist struggles. And these formations of solidarity then offer us openings into dismantling the colonial and capitalist infrastructures. So the work of dismantling then, and this is from the work of care among indigenous communities in Eastern India and the state of West Bengal, that we have carried out for over 2 decades. And this work is fundamentally about building infrastructures for everyday radical democracy, where communities participate in decision-making, in defining what is development, what is health, what is well-being, turning to local knowledge systems, but working through these knowledge systems to imagine emancipatory spaces and possibilities. So dismantling then turns to these processes of co-option by whiteness, recognizing that decolonization itself is often co-opted by whiteness in order to perpetuate whiteness. It has to, decolonization has to dismantle the incorporation of the decolonization turn by whiteness, because whiteness finds a way to expand itself through accommodation, through reforms that take up certain cultural essentialisms only to perpetuate them. So these cultural essentialisms have to be continually questioned. So in Asia, for instance, the Asian turn as a language for further propelling capitalist colonial interests has to be deconstructed and resisted. This process of dismantling has to turn to looking at the ways in which racist prison systems and capitalist systems can be challenged, the ways in which ongoing forms of erasure can be challenged. Now, this is an image I bring up as an exemplar of the ways in which decolonization has been co-opted by hegemonic structures to perpetuate capitalist, colonial, racist systems. So in this example, I bring up the ongoing uptake of the language of decolonization by far-right, hegemonic political formations within the context of India, known as Hindutva. Hindutva is a nationalist movement that seeks to construct India as a Hindu nation based upon the idea of a monolithic Hindu culture or Sanskriti, and based upon the notion of a monolithic Hindu race or jati. Now, this process of incorporation of decolonization is well captured in this narrative of decolonizing dharma that then holds up Hindutva, and in doing so simultaneously marks India's Muslim minorities as the other, and justifies a wide array of strategies of violence directed at Muslims to exclude them as they are marked as the other. So decolonization is the ongoing work of critical reflexivity, interrogating the articulation of uncritical tradition as faith, the production and circulation of culture as a site of othering that marks the other in order to perpetuate colonial violence. Decolonization has to fundamentally ask this question of the ways in which culture is being produced and circulated as a regressive value system to hold up capitalist and colonial infrastructure. So the ways in which, in fact, decolonization is being incorporated, ironically, to serve the interests of capital and colonization. The modernist construction of culture as an essence, as a static entity that can be captured and reproduced. So you see this in movements toward cultural measurement or cultural metrics or cultural capacity building that mark culture as an essence that can somehow be captured. But that notion of culture as an essence is also integral to the perpetuation of hegemonic formations such as you see in the instances of Hindutva. And this whole process then legitimizes racism and frames it as decolonization. You certainly see it in the conversations on Asian values that on one hand capture all of Asia into a homogeneous hegemonic entity, and on the other hand then simultaneously continue to erase the others of Asia that are at the margins or at the periphery. So this process of decolonization, if you will, has to continually interrogate the ways in which the language of decolonization serves the interests of capitalism and colonialism. So the practice of decolonization that dismantles hegemonic communication infrastructures, it fundamentally turns to a few key elements. First of all, it disrupts the individualistic reductionism of whiteness. And simultaneously, it organizes alternative rationalities that are grounded in imaginaries that have long been held by people and communities, but that question the logics of extraction and profiteering as the necessary logics to organize the world. This process also disrupts, the message centrism that we see in much of the social sciences, certainly in a strand of social psychology and in a strand of communication that seeks to address problems by crafting the right kind of message, where the understanding is that only if you find the right message can you solve the problem. Simultaneously, it resists this ongoing process of financialization, where everyday life resources and resources of well-being are marked as commodities, are given financial values, and are then incorporated into financial chains of profiteering. And this process itself is vital to resisting the neoliberal capture of life forms. And through this process of resistance, organizing brings about structural transformation by questioning the logics of capital, by challenging the racist disciplinary structures that continually seek to reduce culture to an essence only to incorporate it. So decolonizing theory in that sense is embodied theorizing. It is theorizing that is done through the body. It is theorizing that is not limited to the infrastructure of the university as a colonial capitalist infrastructure. In the words of Tame Iti, a Maori activist and an artist who we hosted as an activist in residence at CARE, the systems decolonization is about fundamentally moving the systems of knowledge generation outside the university. So in the context of the Maori worldview, he talks about moving knowledge systems from the university into the marae. The marae is a traditional space of gathering for Maori. I find a resonance of that with the work of the culture-centered approach with communities, local communities across the global South, where the participation of community members, and here you see the women participating in the articulation of knowledge to look at the ways in which they can address the challenges with agriculture amidst climate change. Of course, they experience climate change through their bodies, through their everyday struggles to grow crops in the field, among changing weather patterns, among the depletion of rainfall. So their articulation of knowledge then is tied to their embodied practices of growing crops, of struggling with growing crops amidst the changing weather patterns. So culture-centered approach then as a framework for decolonizing these hegemonic knowledge systems turns to this question of communicative equality, and particularly equality in the infrastructures through which knowledge is generated. So it suggests that ongoing processes of marginalization are produced through communicative inequalities, and therefore looks at the ways in which the work of decolonization can turn into seeking to generate communicative equality in the distribution of information resources, resources for representation and decision making, and most fundamentally, resources for voice. So how can those at the margins, those at the margins of the margins, participate in communicative infrastructures to generate knowledge, and through the articulation of knowledge, participate in decision-making processes? And this question of communicative equality then turns into the question of ownership. So how can ownership be thought of in terms of community participation, where communities own the infrastructures of information, the resources for representation, the resources for decision making, and the resources for voice. Now, if we consider the ongoing processes of colonialism and capitalism as processes that have fundamentally excluded communities from these infrastructures and resources of participation, representation, decision making, and voice, then the process of decolonization in the culture-centered approach is fundamentally about returning community sovereignty and community sovereignty over communicative resources, or what I conceptualize in the work of the culture-centered approach as community communicative ownership. So communicative and structural inequalities are intertwined. So the lack of the resources for representation, the lack of access to the spaces where community voices can be recognized is what fundamentally shapes the lack of access to resources, to policies and spaces of decision making. As an embodied theory, or a theory that seeks to engage the question of decolonization through the body, the culture-centered approach then suggests that we need to build voice infrastructures where communities can participate in everyday decision making, can participate in articulating their knowledge claims, which can offer entry points for challenging the systems of colonialism and capitalism. And these voice infrastructures at the same time are situated amidst the interplays between structure, culture, and agency. So the voice infrastructures themselves are situated amidst and in negotiation with hegemonic structures. They offer opportunities for agency to be expressed, and at the same time, communities struggle to enact their agency in building these voice infrastructures, often drawing upon cultural norms, cultural value systems that are dynamic and are continually changing. So the culture-centered approach, then drawing upon the work of Gayatri Spivak, asks how do we learn to learn from below and build an infrastructure of patient listening to an ethic of the other that can offer us entry points for other imaginations. And this process is fundamentally rooted in building voice infrastructures that are owned by communities, including digital infrastructures that enable structural transformation, noting simultaneously that the overarching logics that often shape these infrastructures, including the digital infrastructures, are located in the overarching organizing logics of capitalism and colonialism. So it's a question that negotiates the possibilities of transformation, and at the same time that acknowledges the ways in which this transformation is shaped by the hegemonic logics of capitalism and colonialism and their ways of organizing spaces. So inverting the dominant structures of meaning making is about the ongoing negotiations of the struggles to co-create communicative infrastructures. Now I want to turn to, for the next 10 minutes or so of the talk, to some examples of the ways in which communities enact their sovereignty in struggles for decolonization. So in these struggles for decolonization, the ongoing articulations of communities point to this necessity and urgency for co-creating voice infrastructures where their voices can be heard, and through their participation in these voice infrastructures, they offer entry points for structurally transforming the ways in which health risk crises are constructed. So what is really vital to note here is, through the participation of communities in these voice infrastructures, the processes of transformation actually are directed at the structures rather than being directed at the individuals. So if you return back to that individualizing reductionist logics, it is really important to know that the processes of organizing dismantle those logics by foregrounding the structures that need transformation through community participation. So here's an example within the context of Maori organizing in Aotearoa, where the community struggle for health is defined as the struggle of indigenous communities to own the spaces of food generation, food as the basis for regenerating life, but also about returning to and connecting back with indigenous ways of growing food that are rooted in ideas of sharing, that are rooted in ideas of collective well-being.
So we're planting out here in our marakai, he tipu, he kamo, he hua whenua. So these are at, what age would these be, Bruce? About, yeah, these are a couple of weeks old, our tipus here. And these are the shoots and that of the kamo. And what will happen with these kamo as they get older, they'll start to spread out. So hence why we need to have the 2 metre distance between each one, because they can grow their tubers, they can grow that way, and they can take over about, how much space would you call that?
A couple of metres square.
Yeah, about a couple of metres square. That's how much they will spread out. So this is our kamo. See these plants, see these shoots and that coming out now?
Yeah.
So they'll grow up and these ones will grow out, hence why we've got the leaves here. Once these grow out, they'll grow this way and then it'll be like that. That's how they grow. And then they'll line themselves on the whenua, on our papatuanuku, and then they just start to spread. They'll be like this. And they just go and go and go. They'll flower first, these ones, before they're ready to harvest. And depends, I think on these ones we might get kamo that about that big. We may get them that big. We may just get the little ones. And today, it's the day after Rako Nui. The moon is in the full moon of Rako Nui. So the next day is, like today, is a very good day for planting and a very good day for fishing, and as well as tomorrow. Yeah, well, there's a te ao Māori tikanga around planting and that, and we like to align ourselves with our papatuanuku, our whenua, rangi ki runga, our sky papa as well, because all these elements in te ao Māori, we believe, all help with the growing of our tipu. With our plant, we've got the soil, and we thank papatuanuku for the beautiful soil that she's been able to produce. And we also have to remember too that our tipu that's growing, even though they're babies right now, as they grow their tubers in the ground or wherever, they'll have a whole different underneath the soil. So even though we see what's going on top, there's a whole new world underneath the soil. And that all helps as well. Yeah, our te ao Māori practices to do with, te mariki, our matariki, our moon phases as well, our lunar system here in Aotearoa. We plant by the moon, we plant, which is really important for us because the solace moon and our helps as well. It's a bit like the tides in that of Tangaroa as well. And it's the same cycles of the moon that will help grow our marakai here. Well, I'm very excited because this is the first time that we've planted kamo here on our gardens and our marakai. So I can't wait. Kamo is a very sweet, juicy vegetable. It accompanies any food sources, your meat, your vegetables, even you can have them in salads. I like mine with potatoes and mashed together. And it's Yeah, not everybody likes them. I mean, each to their own, but Māori love kamu kamu. Our Mara Tiara, so this was once all Tiara's land, hence why we call it Mara Tiara. And it's, I mean, for us culturally, it's very special. It's who we are too. I mean, it sustains our mauri, our ihi. We have our awa right beside us, or rawa. We're facing straight out here to our maunga ruahine. So we're surrounded by all our tupuna of Te Ao Māori.
So you see in this example the ways in which the infrastructures for voice co-create the infrastructures for knowledge articulation, which then build the basis for enacting and embodying indigenous sovereignty in the form of sovereignty over agricultural practices and building sustainable food systems. Now, within this context, the work of Marakai in the community sustains the community through the generation of food. That is vital amidst the struggles with COVID, amidst the rising prices of food items, and creates a basis for connecting to nutrients, connecting to forms of nutrition that are indigenous. Now, this voice infrastructure is also tied to the struggle then, as you see, the growing of crops is connected to the land. And as you see in the articulation of Aunt Selina, who was in the earlier video talking about the work of growing kai or food, land is fundamental to the generation of food, and food and the crops give back to the land even as they take nutrients from the land. So this process of organizing then to generate food is also about the process of reclaiming land back. So here is an example of the community organizing to reclaim land that is being taken from the community by the council, or that is being threatened to be taken from the community under the language of development, under the language of building an infrastructure, a dam to prevent flooding. So the hegemonic language of climate change and adapting to climate change works powerfully within the context of colonialism and capitalism to further carry out land theft. And for indigenous and local communities across the global south, then the struggle is to retain sovereignty over the land. So the resistance then works in the form of enacting indigenous sovereignty by struggling against the extractive forces of capitalist and colonial expansion, and by articulating indigenous ownership and control over land and public resources. Our whānau voices matter. So these voice infrastructures form the basis of the articulation of resistance. I want to wrap up then by talking about the ways in which the struggle for decolonization is fundamentally about building community-owned spaces of love, or for Maori, it's called aroha. So aroha, or love, as a basis for transforming the whiteness of the individualizing structures, co-creating community solidarities as the spaces for collective resilience, but also for collective resistance against the forces of colonialism and capitalism. So cultural centering is the process of seeding the narratives of transformation that turn to the anti-colonial struggles against the occupation of land, the extraction of resources, and the exploitation of labor. So this process then sustains everyday solutions that respond to the crises and risks that are brought about by the ongoing global transformations created by the forces of capitalism and colonialism. So what indigenous voices, what the voices of local communities tell us is another world is possible. Not only is it possible, but that it is already here, it is already being lived in community lives. Our struggle is in the work of building the voice infrastructures that recognize diverse forms of knowledge anchored in the ethic of patient listening to the other. So I want to wrap up by playing this video. This is a video of an event put together by Tangata Whenua, the ancestors and the inhabitants of a space called Highbury in Palmerston North, in the backdrop of where Massey University, the university where I teach, is located. And here you can see that the struggle for knowledge and voice infrastructure is held up by Aroha and is circulated through songs, through music, and in this context, a celebration of Matariki, the Maori New Year. So Matariki offers the context through which knowledge is shared, but also that knowledge sharing is embedded in community life, connected to food, connected to experiences and feelings, connected to sound and touch.
Maybe 10 of us, 12 of us have all been getting together for the last probably 5 weeks, organising this beautiful and wonderful Matariki event celebration for 2021, all sort of being taitokoing each other and just supporting each other, getting it all organised and, gathering up all the resources and the tools and, yeah.
This Matariki event is to come together as one and celebrate our Māori New Year. And all different cultures, nationalities, we all come together as one and celebrate our Matariki.
But everybody, like everyone, that's all the members of the advisory high group, it's just been amazing. Everyone's just helped each other and get everything here and set up and ready for tonight's event.
We actually come together as a whānau and discuss, what things we can do for our community and how we can progress with a lot of our mati. So I've been with the group 3 years now. So, in those 3 years I've seen how we've progressed.
Just coming together as part of a community, part of the Highbury community, and just getting together and just sort of creating this amazing event.
We need our whānau within the Highbury area to come together as one, where we support each other, where our community come together and we can be safe within our Highbury area.
I think with communities like ours, often the press looks for the negative story, but there are lots of positive stories happening all the time. The community can get together to do positive stuff, and we need to hear more about it. I think just be really proud of where we all live. I mean, I live here too, and we need to be proud of our community and speak positively about it to people.
Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to the question and answer session.